Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jamie Conway-Baker, and I'm here today to talk to you about tailored catalyst processing. I'm from the Mastermelt group of companies, which have been processing catalysts for over 30 years, and have got one of the largest capabilities in the whole industry. But what does processing catalysts mean? Well, if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer, you will use precious metal catalysts. Once they've lost their activity, they need to be recycled for you to get that valuable metal back. That's the service that we offer. We have sites in the UK, in Tennessee in the US, and in Singapore. So we opened in Singapore in 2016 to serve Southeast Asia. And we're very pleased to announce today, for the first time in public, about our new plant. Our new plant will be just outside of Frankfurt in Schaffenburg, and it will cover our continental European base, where we're seeing a lot of growth at the moment. The plant will be operational at the end of Q1 next year and be a full processing site. So let's talk a little bit more about the precious metals and how they're used in catalysis. For the sake of the presentation, I'll refer to palladium, which is the most common metal used, although platinum, gold, rhodium, they're used also. One type of catalyst is a heterogeneous catalyst. So this is a palladium on carbon, a palladium on silica, and this is the real workhorse of the industry. So this is used a lot in hydrogenation reactions and synthesis, and there's been a steady use of palladium for the last 20 years. Also now we're seeing the growth in homogeneous catalysis. So this is palladium as a molecule with a ligand that'll be in a liquid phase. These homogeneous catalysts are used more in coupling reactions. And cross-coupling is an area of huge growth for the industry. So, interesting fact that we found out that over the last 20 years, cross-coupling has actually seen the fastest growth as a synthesis method in the whole of the pharma industry. And that's driven by the need for more complex APIs, for more advanced therapies. The top graph shows the use of palladium in the pharma fine chem sector. So you can see it's steady. It's probably topping out at around 500,000 ounces. Below you can see the palladium price graph, and you can see that palladium has been steadily increasing over the last 5 years and is now at record levels. That palladium price is driven by supply-demand fundamentals. However, in maybe the last 4 or 5 years, the demand has outstripped what's mined from underground and what's recycled. But there have been buffer stocks. So these buffer stocks have helped shore up the overall capacity, which has meant that the price rises haven't been as high. However, in the last 2 years, those buffer stocks have been depleted. So the market's truly in deficit, and that's led to the real price spike you can see for the last 2 years. This is not forecast to improve, and whilst I cannot predict the palladium price, I wish I could, but unfortunately I can't. My estimate would be that it would stay at relatively high levels for the next few years. So when you put these two together, consistent demand, record prices, this comes to around an annual spend of $900 million spent on palladium in the pharma fine chem sector. So that is a significant amount of money, and now is the time to look at how you can optimize getting that palladium back. So let's look at, how can you do that? How does it work? Well, the first stage is looking at the mass balance, or as I like to call it, the mass imbalance. When you look at the material that goes into your process, The catalyst from a manufacturer will have an assay, it will have a weight, but each batch of catalyst will have a slightly different assay. Each batch of catalyst will have a slightly different moisture content, and you need to take these into account when you calculate how much you've actually put in. If you add to that things like differences in scale calibration, the accuracy of putting down exactly how much you put into each batch, are you getting extraction losses when you load the catalyst into the reactor? You can easily look at a 1 to 2% difference between what you think you've put in and what you've actually put in. Unfortunately, whatever you put in, you never get 100% of it back out. And we've highlighted some of the loss mechanisms at the bottom of the slide. For a supported heterogeneous catalyst, the particles rub together and you get fine and ultrafine particles generated. And these particles can sometimes have a higher palladium content than the actual catalyst itself. For a homogeneous liquid catalyst, it's a little bit more difficult. You've either got to use a scavenger or an absorbent to selectively take that palladium up, or you've got to use a distillation evaporation method to separate your mother liquor or product. This will generate a tar which can be further refined. So both of these methods can work, but equally they have loss mechanisms inbuilt in them. So that's something that, again, we can help with. One aspect that's slightly counterintuitive is that we do see issues with materials tracking and accounting. Now, the pharmaceutical industry is world leaders in managing the good manufacturing practice of their APIs. But that's where their focus is. And I think we've seen that the focus on managing the API means that sometimes the management of the precious metals, management of all the materials can be suboptimal, and there can be areas where a fresh pair of eyes can help. Typically, we see losses of between 5% and 25% of what the customer puts into the process. And our goal is to work with the customer to get closer to that 5%. Here are some of our top tips that we'd like to share. I'll go through a couple of them with you, but I'm happy to talk later in more detail. So for the fine and ultrafine particles that are generated, you need to separate those with filtration. But the type of filtration technology you use, the number of stages you have, the final absolute micron rating, these are all areas that need to be looked at in significant detail. And sometimes when you separate out those filters, not all of them go to your refiner. Sometimes they're disposed of. So I think we'd recommend that once you unload your catalyst, once you have these filters, they all go into sealed containers. And by sealed, I don't mean a cable tie, I mean a numbered security seal. One thing that has additionally helped a number of customers is that for precious metals for refining, they put them in different colored drums. It's a very simple thing, but it error-proofs the materials tracking. So once you have your spent catalyst, spent production items, what happens when it gets to your refiner? Well, the PGM refining model is not really well understood in the industry by everyone. So I thought it's worth taking some time just to go through it today. When you send your catalyst to a refiner, they will process, sample, and assay that catalyst. They then perform a calculation to calculate how much precious metals is contained. So what happens to the catalyst then? Well, it goes into the refining circuit. It gets mixed with other materials, it loses its identity, and this leads to two phenomena. One is that the metal that you actually get back in your product or in your metal transfer is not the same material that you've sent them. The second point is that no one actually knows exactly how much metal was refined from that catalyst. Everything goes back to the calculation on how much was there. So this really reinforces the need to analyze that catalyst very accurately. The way that this is done is it's quite a complex process, but let's start at the back end. Let's start with the assaying. So you need to make sure that you've got an optimized assay method. So this would typically be, say, a fire assay method, maybe with an ICP finish, and carried out by a competent, well-trained laboratory. But the sample that you've sent for assay is less than a gram. And this 1 gram has to represent all of the catalyst that you've sent. So how do we do that? Well, the trick is to turn it into a powder, to mill it to a very, very fine particle size, to blend it using state-of-the-art techniques, and to carry out multiple samplings to reduce the volume each time. So that will mean that you've got an accurate sample in your 1 grams. But how do you turn your catalyst, which is carbon, organics, water, could even be filters, how do you turn that into a powder? And this comes the critical step of thermal oxidation. This is where Mastermelts have developed proprietary processes, equipment, and systems to make sure that the process is optimized and tailored to your catalyst. If you get this step wrong, the thermal treatment, you could have significant metal losses, and also you could raise some very, very hazardous process safety conditions. So it is really the key part. The way that we like to talk about it is we talk about a tailored process, because it's not just the equipment we've optimized, it's using the Mastermelt experience and the Mastermelt methods and putting it all together. So in practice, that would mean if we had a new catalyst material come in, we would first compare it with our class library. So we know the catalysts that are out there and how you would treat them. So that enables us to design the process at lab scale. So this might mean that when we trial it at lab scale, there may be chemical additives, pre-treatments. We may modify the atmosphere in the actual thermal oxidation for that particular catalyst. So once we've designed it, we run it at a modified production scale, which enables us to set benchmarks. So these are actual production benchmarks which we set. And we ensure that the catalyst is processed, hits those benchmarks at a modified production scale. But you need a cost-effective process, an efficient process, and a fast process. So that's what we do next. We scale it up to full production scale all the time, making sure that it tracks back with our benchmarks, with our KPIs. Just to put this in a bit of context, I'll give you some case studies. With our tailored process, we have worked with some large customers who have a number of different sites. And for those customers, we offer our Catalyst Care program. So this is where we work more closely with the customer. We conduct site audits. We manage more of the data to show up any anomalies and to give them more information about how we can help them. This particular customer was a top 10 Pharma Fine Chem customer who ran the same process at a number of different sites globally. The catalyst that was the spent catalyst from this process was extremely hazardous and offered a number of safety issues in processing. This led to a number of refiners to turn it down because they just couldn't process the material. So we were able to develop a process that was not only safe, but it also gave them an increase in recovery from what they had before. We then looked at how we could help them on a global basis. And we soon saw that the recoveries from different sites, they varied. And sometimes the time difference between getting the full results of the evaluation of the catalyst meant that we couldn't find out what actually happened on site. So we agreed a protocol with them, which was when the catalyst came to our site, we took a pre-sample. So this is before the material was processed. We're able then to run a very fast analysis to give a ballpark figure of how much palladium was contained. We could turn that around very quickly. We then processed about 10% of the catalyst, scaled that result up, and then compared that with our pre-sample to see, were things still on the right track. We then finally had the result at the end of processing. So we got a number of data points at different time points through the system. This is a collection of results. So here you can see the results of the pre-sample. And as you'd expect, there's quite a lot of variation. In round numbers, around plus or minus 5% from the average final figure. So this means that there's no way that you could actually settle with the customer or pay the customer, because one time they could get 5% more metal, the next time they could get 5% less metal. So you need something more accurate. But this would give you a bit of an early warning if something went wrong. The select 10% sample, you could see was again closer, and this was around 3% variance. So the errors are coming down, and you could see that this information now could be used for metal forecasting, for supply chain, and then finally we get the variance of our final result. This is through all the sampling and assaying. And this was plus or minus 1% variance. So I think this graph really shows that to get to an accurate answer, you have to thermally treat the catalyst, you have to sample 100% of that catalyst, and you have to assay it using recognized techniques. So what did this do for the customer? How was there a benefit? If we take two plants, so the customer who ran this process knew they had an issue with palladium actually leaching into their mother liquor. So that meant that they were looking for they were accepting a 10-15% loss. And we're working with them as a separate project on how to recover that. So their benchmark would be around 85 to 90%. But you could see that the third delivery we had, the recovery was a lot lower. And what we were able to do was, with our pre-sample, we were able to get back to the catalyst category manager within 72 hours to say, hey, we think there's a problem. The early warning system's gone off, something's gone wrong. That enabled them in turn to go to their plant manager and find that a number of the drums containing precious metals actually got mixed up and were going to be sent for disposal. Because we were so fast to act, it meant that those drums could be recovered and the metal come to us. So that saved a very costly mistake. On another plant, we saw that the overall recoveries were trending quite a bit lower than the other plants. So we did a site audit. We went through the whole process. We went through how they ran their catalyst, what their recovery system was like. And we saw that the way that they ran their reactor meant that the filtration system they used was not optimized for their plant. It was the same that the company used on other sites, but because of some process changes, it meant it didn't fit that particular site. We're able to advise them on different technology to use, and that led to an immediate uptick in recoveries. And we continue to work with this customer very closely to get those incremental small wins to increase the recovery. So I think that takes us through most of the information I wanted to talk to you about today. I think I'd like you to remember that the price of precious metals is so high that now is really the time to optimize your recovery. I think there's a lot of services and expertise that the Mastermelt group can help you with on a local basis and on a global basis. And I think there's so many things we talked about here. We're more than willing to have a much more detailed conversation on our booth to go through some of this in slightly more detail. Our booth is in Hall 4, Floor 2, and you're welcome at any time over the next few days. As an added incentive, we do have a complimentary champagne bar today. So if you are busy throughout the show and you need to wind down, then 5:30 today, come along and we can have that conversation. Because it costs nothing to have a conversation, and it could save you a lot of money. Equally, if you're a contract manufacturer, it could make your bid much more competitive if you optimize the metal management. Thank you very much.